Welcome to Contagious Thinking with Thomas Verstraeten, a podcast from P95. This is where global health gets personal and where data, science, and insight come to life. Let's get the show started.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our podcast, Contagious Thinking, about the status of infectious disease and how we look at it at P95. My name is Tom Verstraeten. I'm the founder and CEO of P95. And today I have a very special guest. Welcome, Edward Sobe-Yarig. We know you as Sobe, joining us from Accra in Ghana.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm happy to be here. My name, as mentioned, is Edward Sobe-Yarig. I'm the operations lead for P95, overseeing P95 activities in West Africa. I started my clinical research journey over 19 years ago. So after my first degree, I started as a research assistant in one of the very old and first research centers in Ghana, in the northern part called Nabrongo Health Research Center. So after working in some epidemiological studies for rotavirus, I went to further my education in a master's in clinical trials, and I came back to grow the clinical trial unit of that center. And I was very lucky to be part of some of the early studies of rotavirus vaccines that we conducted in northern Ghana. I also worked with some meningitis studies as well. So having worked there for 8 years, I moved on to the CRO space, starting as a CRA, and I worked for 8 years, rising to the level of a lead CRA for the West African region. And subsequently, I became a site and resource manager, overseeing clinical operations for one CRO in West Africa. I joined P95 last year, September, as the West Africa operations lead.
You're definitely the right man to have here today and to talk with us about clinical trials in Africa, West Africa, but also the wider African region. So, tell me, clinical research in Africa, how do you see that has evolved over time? You've been there for quite a while. What kind of evolution have you seen over the past couple of decades?
Prior to 2010, I will say some of the studies that were done in sub-Saharan Africa were basically on epidemic diseases and maybe tropical diseases, mainly malaria, meningitis, and rotavirus. And these were mostly a collaboration with institutions in Europe or in the US, where some key opinion leaders in the sub-region collaborate with them to do studies like maybe epidemiological studies or drug trials. But during that time, there was actually very limited local expertise. And of course, the regulatory standards and requirements were very limited. There were not clear established guidelines. And of course, logistics was a problem. For instance, courier services, warehousing, and even qualified labs to be able to support those studies. And of course, there were a lot of concerns around quality of the studies that were delivered and also maybe the community perception about clinical trials, and of course, a great gap in technology because there was low internet penetration in the continent by then. But fast forward around 2011 to 2015, with some epidemics coming into the continent, example is like the Ebola epidemic, sort of provide opportunity for diversity in roles in the continent and people upscaling their competence and be able to provide local solutions to some of these studies that were being coming in. And also with that, we also started seeing CROs coming into the space, and we started seeing diversification beyond just the monitoring of studies. And along that line, we also saw that technology was also being introduced, and because of the internet connectivity, we were able to sort of adopt certain technologies. So I can give an example. Before the study we were doing around 2006, we couldn't actually use any EDC systems. What we used to actually do was we will complete the paper CRFs and fax these CRFs to our colleagues in Bangladesh for data entry because internet was actually just a big challenge. And the following day you come back and they will also fax all the queries back to you and you resolve them and fax back again. But
Okay. You needed a good fax machine, I'm sure.
yes, and even good telephone connection. If there's a rainstorm, then you see that your fax will not go, and there was a lot of big challenge. But fast forward, we were now able to do what they call EDC data entry, and of course, our regulators became matured, and sort of started creating standards on how we conduct studies in the continent, and also provided clear guideline on predictability of like approval timelines or something like that. But in the past, that was virtually something that was not existent. And of course, during that period, the very first key opinion leader that was leading studies also to train the second generation of researchers. People who also worked under them had opportunity to start setting up their own clinical trial sites to sort of expand on like different therapeutic areas. And of course, with COVID, that sort of increased site capability across the African continent.
Sobe, would it be fair to say it's a bit of a combination of different factors? You mentioned technology seems to be a very important factor that has really helped the continent forward. But combined with that, some natural, maybe less fortunate occurrences like the Ebola pandemic, the COVID pandemic, which has kind of pushed research beyond its previous limits within Africa. And then, of course, training and education of a larger pool of researchers across the continent, which has put Africa in a much better position today than it would have been, let's say, 20 years ago or more when you started your career.
Yes, so even people now started seeing clinical trials as also a business. So there was now an investment. So people were intentional about investing in the ecosystem. Started seeing that normal courier companies started providing specialized services tailored for clinical trial, like providing warehousing for maybe IP, lab logistics, and all that. And the continent started opening up. Places that we could not reach, people started putting up offices or opening up hubs to be able to facilitate this. And also, in terms of lab capability, because of the stringent requirement for clinical trials, we started seeing people having specialized labs, and even institutions had to upgrade their lab capability to be able to support the growing demand and the quality that is so required in delivering clinical trials.
And what I also heard you mention before is collaboration across the continent between different countries. So if I'm a sponsor and I'm developing a new drug or a new vaccine in North America or in Europe, and I'm considering doing my trials in Africa for various reasons. Say I have in mind I'd like to do a trial in Ghana, somewhere in East Africa, Tanzania or Kenya, maybe also South Africa, and if possible, I would like to add the DRC to the countries I'd like to do the study. How do I go about it? How do I get this trial going across all these countries today in Africa?
Yeah, so I'll probably just start by saying, then you come to P95 because
Of course, of course. So what will P95 do for me?
yes, so as you know, P95 we grew very organically in the continent, and we have local expertise who have worked in the continent for over 20 years. We have established very strong site network across Africa. We have a very good collaboration and working relationship with the regulators. We know what it takes to conduct studies across all these countries. But in terms of the general requirement to conduct clinical trials in Africa, definitely approvals are always key. Most countries that do clinical trials, they have the regulators authority that will definitely provide clinical trial authorization for the conduct of those studies, as well as their national ethics committee or institutional review committees. So definitely the part is to go through this approval process. But of course, we have grown with some of the epidemics that have happened. We have AVAREF, an institution that's able to coordinate joint review of clinical trials for all countries in the sub-region. And if you want to trigger the AVAREF pathway, then you need to first write to the AVARES. But of course, you need to appoint maybe a CRO like P95 who is very familiar with the processes in Africa to sort of support that startup phase. They'll review your protocol to see whether it meets the requirements. Then, of course, for all the membership countries, they will trigger the process and provide the requirements for the submission package. And in this case, when we are using the average pathway, you don't have to submit individual to each country regulatory authority again. They will do a joint review, and the approval will be binding on all the other countries. But however, you need to still pay the regulatory authority review fee for the individual countries. I think they've also added the component of ethics review now. Yeah, but in the past, I think that was not incorporated. It was all the regulatory review that they will do, and it will be binding, and it sort of shortened the timeline. But then again, if you don't want to go through the average pathway, you need to also be able to know the country regulations on approvals of the clinical trial. So you need to submit individual to each country, and they have their different timelines and maybe the requirements for the submission.
So if I understand, Sobe, it is really up to the sponsor to choose if they want to go the EverF pathway or if they still want to go to each individual country.
Yes, but for P95, we are able to provide clear guidelines on the timelines for the various countries, because we having worked in the continent, we know the regulations, we know the timelines for every country, we know the requirements. So we're able to guide you through how long it will take to get the approvals and to predict your steady start approval timeline.
One element that always comes up when you discuss about doing clinical trials in Africa, maybe more so than in other continents, is the community engagement, to make sure the community is engaged. Have you seen any evolution in that as well? Is there a higher willingness to participate in clinical trials in Africa now? How do people look at that in general?
Community engagement is actually very key in the clinical research space. We in Ghana learned a special case during the Ebola period, whereby there was misinformation about a trial that was going to be done in a particular region, and the public was misinformed about what clinical trials are all about. And people literally use the word trial. Trial means you are using people as guinea pigs and all that. So it became very central, and that trial could even go ahead. So most institutions that are doing clinical trials or clinical research really take community engagement very, very serious. And I think some sponsors does not see the investment in this, but it's really important. It's provide opportunity for the community buy-in in the drug development process. So if the community are not well informed, especially in this day and age where there's this social media, you see one person just make a comment and it will just destroy all the effort have been put in. So it's very, very key. And from my experience, when I used to work at the site level, it is always the first thing that we do. Once you have your protocol approved, you need to do a community engagement whereby the community levels, they will engage with chiefs, opinion leaders, church leaders to explain the purpose of the study in plain language, not technical, scientific. And with that, everybody understands what the study is all about, so that if somebody is even misinforming them, then they're able to tell, look, we know more about this study than you. So it's really key, and I think it's something that we should be intentional about it and support the sites in terms of maybe funding to be able to do proper community engagement when you are commencing any study. Also, one of the things that most of the ethics committee does also recommend, you don't just enter the community and start doing studies, but you need to let the people be informed. And it should be throughout the study. As part of the consenting process, although you consent the individual participants, you can still, from time to time, provide information like flyers, updates on the study, provide information in radio stations about what is happening in the community and all that.
Very important, definitely. So, your experience, you mentioned a few infectious diseases. You've worked on rotavirus, you worked on meningitis, you worked on Ebola, you worked on Lassa fever as well.
Yes.
All these are infectious disease. And of course, I think a lot of people, when they think of research in Africa, they probably think of infectious diseases as a primary therapeutic area where you would maybe want to do your study in Africa. What about other therapeutic areas? Is there room to do studies in other therapeutic areas like metabolic diseases, neurological diseases, oncology? Can such research be done in Africa? And is there a willingness to do that research in Africa as well?
Yes, definitely. So I didn't mention, but I've also done some study in sickle cell diseases, and I could say from 2001, Africa used to contribute less than 1% of sickle cell disease population. But fast forward, some sites got opportunity to participate in sickle cell diseases, and I could say because of the disease burden in Africa, they are able to now contribute significantly to the enrollment of sickle cell disease. Some studies which take over 1 year or 2 years to recruit the required number of participants. If Africa is involved, you see that recruitment is always quicker. And with that mentioned, some of the second generation of researchers have also diversified in the therapeutic areas. Sickle cell being one, oncology also coming up very strongly because we do have a huge burden of that disease in our teaching hospitals. And with the right support, we're able to build site within the teaching hospitals to do oncology study because we have the specialists there. You just need to add that component of a clinical trial unit that is well structured with all the standard operating procedures, with specialized labs to be able to support that. So there's a huge potential, and a lot of work is still already ongoing in the African continent.
Maybe asking it a different way, what kind of studies do you think you should not even try to come to Africa? Or is there anything that you say, maybe we should not do that? Or is there basically no limit?
There's no limit. Africa has come of age, and the expertise are in the continent. It is just the opportunity. And quality have improved drastically because we have now strong regulators and they're supporting the growth of studies in the continent. And I can say from my experience, some of the oncology studies that we tried to do in my former company, the regulator had to do pre-inspections, support the sites to say, okay, you need to put these systems in place before we give the approval. So they work with the regulators to set up the system so that when you do, you don't fail because we don't want the situation whereby studies will be approved and the data cannot be used because we're already not getting enough studies into the continent. So now everybody's intentional about making sure that we get it right in Africa. So there's no study that we can't do because most of the people who are even leading studies have equally trained abroad, have done studies abroad. And with big organizations like us, P95, we have expertise across the globe that can support studies to be able to meet the standards. So I can say Africa, there's nothing that we can do that is done elsewhere.
That's great to hear, and fantastic progress has been made there. So we're in 2025 now. We're in a kind of a special geopolitical reality. There's a new administration in North America. There's a new kind of administration also at the FDA. And one of the new strategies or new headwinds that we hear from the FDA is that they're again would like to move back to placebo-controlled trials as a sort of a default standard to do clinical trials. How is that viewed in Africa? Is that an option to do placebo-controlled trials in Africa? How do regulators and ethic committees look at that across Africa?
I think with the maturity of our regulators and having done some studies, most regulators were actually moving away from placebo-controlled trials. However, if there's a justification for a placebo-controlled trial, then I think it will go through. But most regulators will require that the participant in the control group should at least have an active comparator that is of benefit to them. So for some of the studies that we have done, we'll see for some, maybe Lassa fever vaccine, we'll see the control group being given rabies vaccine, which also confers some kind of protection to the control group. But of course, you can still be able to measure your vaccine effect. But if there's a strong justification why you need to go the route of a placebo, then I think it will go through because the protocol was very clear on why you think an active control should not be used.
So do I hear you well, Sobi? This can be discussed. This is a possibility. However, each individual trial might be different and needs a justification if that is the route one would like to go.
Exactly. And I will just add that with our engagement with the regulator, most regulators provide opportunity for even pre-submission meetings, whereby if you have your process or your protocol, it provides opportunity for you to pose questions that you think the regulator has clear guidelines against to explain your point. And they're always willing to have that discussion with you before you do the submission.
Sobi, I'd like to discuss with you, which you have raised to me before and kind of at first surprised me, but then I learned you were actually totally right. It's the genetic diversity in Africa.
Yes.
When we look at Africa and we think of genetic diversity, we tend to mostly think, okay, different racial backgrounds, and therefore in Africa, maybe that would be less the case, but actually that's not true. There's no continent with such big genetic diversity as Africa.
Most people outside of Africa see Africa as a country, but Africa is actually a very big continent with different people so genetic diversity is really important. And in the past, most drugs were developed not maybe with blacks in the Europe or in different continent, but not in the African continent. So it is now becoming tropical, and most regulators are now pushing that for drugs that are intended for the African market, you need to include some data from Africa. It's a reality that what works in the Caucasian will not definitely work in the black. The drug dosage or strength that will be effective in a different population might work differently in a black population. So it's really, really important that we push to have Africa included if the drug is intended for the African market as well.
And preferably across different African populations as well to reflect that diversity.
We have Southern Africa, East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, and North Africa. So definitely it'd be good to have data across this African continent to actually show that.
Which of course will increase your trial size if that's something you would like to have, if you'd like to have a wider population.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Another statistic that caught my attention recently, the United Nations expects that by the year 2050, which is only 25 years away from now, 2 out of 5 children will be born in Africa. And if you look at specific countries, 1 out of 10 children will be Nigerian as of 2050 across the whole world. Those are very impressive statistics and something we probably don't always think about. But that shows that you will have a very strong pediatric population in Africa. What's the situation with doing trials in the pediatric population in Africa? Are there any special limitations, or is this comparable to what you would see in other continents?
There's no special requirement to do studies in pediatric population. Most regulators have clear guidelines on conducting studies on vulnerable population. Those guidelines are very clear on conducting studies on vulnerable population, including children. And there is also special care in terms of the inspections or the oversight on the such populations. So definitely you need people, specialists in pediatric, people who are able to take care of children, to be involved in overseeing the conduct of those studies.
But there's no specific taboo or there's no specific issue in doing studies in children?
No, definitely. Most of all the vaccines that we have as part of our expanded program of immunization, those studies were done in children. So the rotavirus vaccines that we did were recruiting neonates because we needed to have those vaccines administered at a very early age, as 6 weeks, 10 weeks, and 14. So the experience in conducting studies in young children has grown over the years, and the guidelines are very clear on how you go about conducting those studies.
So, Sobe, if I could try and summarize a little bit, different elements or arguments we have talked about, that might favor doing your clinical trial research in Africa. We started with technology, right? Technology, I think, is key. Of course, technology is global, but it certainly has helped the African continent very fast forward in moving from what you described like a pretty old-fashioned facts-based exchange of information to modern electronic exchange. That certainly is a key factor. There's obviously the whole population element, which it's a very big population. It's a very diverse population, and it's also age-wise a very diverse population where you probably will have the strongest pediatric or the highest pediatric population worldwide very soon. Another important element is the collaboration between the countries.
Yes.
We have AVRF, there's the African Medicines Agency that's coming up. So that is certainly facilitating access to different countries and hopefully will speeden up the process importantly as well. And then there is the whole development of the scientific expertise across the continent, which has also moved very much forward. Whereas before, like you said, you were often dependent on external expertise or external KOLs. Now there's a lot of local expertise, which has reached several generations and gives access to many more potential research sites across the continent.
Right on point.
We haven't talked about cost. I guess there's a lot of discussion these days about the cost of clinical trials. Clinical trials are prohibitively expensive. It makes drugs too expensive, not accessible to everybody. I know that's not the primary driver, but how is that in Africa? Because before, I remember, when I was at GSK and the malaria study was set up, it was expensive because there was all this technology that needed to be invested in different places in Africa. What is it like now? How does cost of clinical research in Africa compare to other continents?
I can say the cost will not be as expensive as it used to be because if you are setting up a study, you needed to put in every infrastructure. From my experience, you needed to put on internet access, you needed to buy computers, you needed to support with lab upgrade, you needed to do so many things. But most sites now have been able to put in those infrastructure over years. The only challenge now is sustainability of those infrastructure. If sponsors or people coming into Africa want to do studies, can be able to sustain those systems, then the cost will continue to go down or become normal as compared to other countries. You see that in the past, the site will virtually have nothing. The only thing they have is the patient population. But now you go to sites, they have state-of-the-art laboratory, they have archive, they have computers, everything's already there, and they have the personnel. The only thing is that they just need the studies to come in. But because there is no continuity of studies coming into the continent, it's always a challenge to maintain the personnel because you need to keep paying them. There is cost of electricity that you need to keep some of the systems going. And of course, you need to renovate your buildings, change equipment from time to time. So if there are continuous studies coming into Africa, those sites will the cost will be minimal. But because we don't have constant studies, so always you need to always go and set up the site all over again. That is the challenge in the African continent.
But I think we are working with a lot of sites where there is a continuous flux of studies. And I think we have also seen at P95 that certainly the cost of those studies is much lower than it might be in some other parts of the world.
Exactly. And at P95, we are very intentional about it. We see our sites as our partners, and we want to ensure that the investment we do in our site is sustainable. So we continue to work and upgrade our site capability. We always support them in training and helping with SOP development. And we try to always channel studies to sites that have the experience to be able to keep going on so that those sites are sustainable. They are able to maintain their staff strength to be able to do more studies.
Sobe, that's a very nice way to conclude. And it was a real pleasure to talk to you today. It's very nice to have experts like you help us understand how to navigate this very promising and developing continent in terms of clinical research.
Thank you very much, Tom, for having me. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for listening to Contagious Thinking, a podcast from P95. You can find us in all major streaming platforms. Join us next time for more conversations that move public health forward.